Um, Henry James's was from part of a great literary family. So his brother was William James, the great psychologist who wrote Varieties of Religious Experience. Why do I mention this? I think because I find that in Henry James, there's a great amount of psychological acuity, an intense interest in the psychological processes of his characters. So I think that it sort of shows through. The other thing I want to say he's part of, for people who are fiction writers, he's part of what I take to be a great generation of writers. I would put him together with Thomas Hardy, the novelist, George Eliot, as being really amazing, technically amazing novel writers who put together amazingly wonderful, like the chapters always end on exactly the right place and begin in exactly the right place. This is largely, do you know why this is?
It's because it was published in newspapers.
Yeah, they were serially published. So at one point, you had people waiting on the docks for the next serialization of a Thomas Hardy novel, who was the most famous novelist of his era, even more famous than Dickens.
Oh, yeah.
So people would be waiting for the next, installment to find out what happens. So that's why they're often broken up like this. Now this, I'm not sure this was serialized. I think it was written for, I think it was written for, published maybe in Atlantic or something. Is that right?
I think I remember.
Anyway, it doesn't matter, but that's why I think that's one of the reasons why they're written this way. But he wrote the whole thing and then published it. He wasn't like he was making it up as he went along, although some novelists have done that. Okay. All right. So Henry James, wonderful. He lived in England most of his life, which is why it's set here. But he's actually an American who lived there. So he's often taught in American novel classes, etc. Okay. So I did the groups already. They're your groups. So I want to talk about some of the themes that arise here because I think they're important. And I'm sure you'll have already figured this out, but I'm going to go ahead and talk about some of it anyway. The first theme that's important to me, partly because my first book was on this theme, is childhood as a sort of structure of, and if you don't, you can take notes if you want, but I'm going to put this whole document up on Carmen. I think it's a good idea to take notes if that helps you to think. I'm often a person that likes to think through writing. So some of the sort of sub-themes within childhood is the theme of innocence in childhood. And there's something here that I didn't write down, but I'll sort of, I think that this is something that he's really interested in. The difference between appearance and reality. So if you remember the scene where she's talking about looking at Flora, and she's saying, "Oh, what a beautiful child." She assumes that Flora and Miles are so beautiful and sweet looking that they will then be beautiful and sweet inside. And that's something that largely is a problem, just the same way in which the uncle is handsome and whatever, so we assume that he is therefore a good person, right? So this question about whether childhood is naturally innocent or not, and a lot of work has been written on this theme. There's a great essay from, I would say it's around 2003, 2004, from a queer studies perspective, talking about the children in this novel and the way they're sexualized in different ways. And it's a very, very provocative but interesting account, so I think that's interesting to me. So in terms of the sexuality, I'm simply pointing out that in the air at this time, in Europe and in the U.S., was this deep interest in two things. One is psychology, and the other is spiritualism. Do you know the difference between spiritualism and spirituality? Spiritualism was this practice that was almost done in groups, not individually, where you would get together in the evening and hold seances, or you would use the Ouija board and ask questions. So these ghost stories is all part of this theme of spiritualism, and this question of something beyond what we can know, something beyond what we immediately intuit. This is all connected to Freud's discovery of the unconscious, right? I shouldn't say it's his discovery, his elaboration of the unconscious. He's the first person to theorize the unconscious. He's not the first person to say we have an unconscious. Obviously, the poets did that and other philosophers and psychologists had done it before. So interpretations of dreams is important because all of the visions and all of the things that happen to the governess, whether or not we want to say that they're on the side of appearance or on the side of reality. If they're on the side of appearance, they're on the side of psychic appearance, right? A kind of hallucination or something like that. And if they're on the side of reality, then we're in the world of a ghost story. And then his really important 3 essays on childhood sexuality, which comes out in 1905. The important thing here is not what he says about childhood sexuality, which some of it has been borne out to be kind of like true, and some of it has been borne out to be ridiculous. But the point is that he argued very much that children are sexual, and this is pretty much true from any early childhood point of view, which is all the more reason to respect them and to take care of them, right? Because they are. Right, so you respect and handle that. You don't expose them to things that are traumatic or overwhelming or overstimulating. But that's the idea. And then sexuality more generally, you have the governess's interest in the uncle. Quint's sexuality, which is also connected to his class position, but we'll come back to that when we deal with the novel. In some strange way, for the governess, I think there's something kind of really powerfully sexual about the uncle, who represents a higher class position, and something very sexual and threatening about the Quint character, who is at a lower class position than she is. So there's a kind of interesting, and the fact that Miss Dressel apparently had a relationship with Quint. Class difference, and I wrote down a couple of page numbers of things that I thought were interesting. The first time that the governess sees herself in a full-length mirror is an interesting moment. It would be sort of like akin to, I don't know, if you had never entered a house that had I don't have one, but what are they, like Alexa, like where you talk to your machine, like some kind of class difference, something that's different than what you would have grown up with. In this case, it's that she would have never had the opportunity to, because they were too expensive, they were a luxury to have a full-length mirror. It's the first time she saw her whole body in one view. And I think that's also very, very interesting in terms of the idea of her self-image or her self-reflection. And there's several markers of class difference. These are just 2 that popped out at me when I was rereading the text yesterday afternoon. Mrs. Gross can't read. I think you also have to be very aware in terms of class difference that James likes to play with names like Flora, right? And here I think, and strangely, the 2 of the main characters in the novel don't have names. Right, exactly. Or that's very common. So James had a character in Portrait of a Lady for this one suitor. His name was Mr. Goodwood, right? So he's very funny. He's very funny with names. But I think we have to also read this name this way. Yeah, right. And by gross, I don't mean here. By gross, I don't actually mean icky and whatever. I mean that other name of gross, which means material. She's very not very bright. She's not very intellectual. She's very material and pragmatic, Mrs. Gross. So in that sense, she's kind of vulgar. Like there's a great line from a Coleridge poem where he says, "Less gross than bodily," and he's talking about the grossness would be something like the gross. Like this, a way to think about it would be to think about gross product. Right? You've heard that use of that word, gross product. It means sort of the bulk. Right, so she's kind of bulky, she's kind of thick, right? And that's, I think, the way we have to think of The theme of the paranormal, and again, I'll put this down here because I didn't think to write it yesterday, but the spiritualism, right? And this is evident in the question, is Quint a ghost? Is there a sort of haunting going on, right? It's also the framing story with the teller of the tale in the beginning. Psychological breakdown, the word for it in the 19th century is hysteria. And if you're thinking this sounds a lot like a gynecological term, that's because they come from the same root. And so in fact hysteria was often a condition that was given to women for postpartum depression, or for any time they didn't want to do things that men wanted them to do. They were often their husbands, without their permission, their husbands could have them committed, and simply have a doctor say, yes, she's hysterical, right? Meaning that she's not being reasonable. She doesn't want to have, I don't know, the 15th child, or she doesn't want whatever it is that she doesn't want to do. And so she's hysterical. And then we'll talk a little bit about a quote from James, but in the preface to the 1908 edition, he says that there's some kind of, her imagination kind of overruns her. And then we'll talk also, I think, about this section. She hints at one point that something is going bad in her family back home in Essex, I think it is. And then finally, all these other 19th century novels concerning governesses, Jane Eyre, Vanity Fair, and there are others. Almost every, let's see if did I put this down? No, or maybe I didn't copy this over. All right, but I took this note from from this edition. The 1851 census revealed that 25,000 women earned their living teaching and caring for other women's children. And this is mid-Victorian period, right? So most governesses lived with their employers, and what they got was room and board and a very small stipend. This was also true of teachers, women teachers, by the way, who taught at like women's colleges and such. They really didn't make they didn't make a living wage. They made a little bit of money that they could spend, but most of they couldn't have. It wouldn't have paid rent or on a house somewhere, but they were given room and board and a little bit of money. So this is the way it was sort of thought of. So any comments on these or other themes that you guys saw? Because I'm certain I overlooked themes that were here that you think are important. I guess maybe I was thinking a little bit, obviously, about some of the theoretical frames that we're going to talk about, like psychoanalysis as a queer theory, Marxism, materialism, class difference.
I can't really think of anything.
Okay.
These are
There could also be something here, a theme of I'm just going to write down family, but I'm not quite sure how to talk about this family society. That there's something very strange about the awkward way in which so often in these novels someone else is raising these children, not the parents, and they are put into situations that are perilous. This happens in Dickens all the time. So one way to think about this would be, in the 19th century, there are all kinds of ways to be orphaned. You could be orphaned simply because one of your parents died, or you could be orphaned simply because they couldn't afford to simply pay for all of you. and it wasn't seen as a bad thing to send a child to a orphanage or something, where, especially in London, like Christ Church School, where Coleridge was sent, it actually had an amazing. They were lucky to have an amazing English teacher, so he learned Greek and Latin and became a pretty impressive scholar by the time he was 13 or 14. But and it was because his father died and couldn't provide for him anymore. But your father wouldn't have to have died. He could have just fallen from a horse and not been able to work. And they would simply either ship you off to a relative or a friend, or you would enter one of these institutions. And it was not considered as whatever. This is a higher class position, obviously. So, all right. So, any questions about these themes or ideas? Okay. I feel like I've talked a lot, so maybe let's turn then and just to the opening of the novel, the prologue. And maybe I'll read the first section, and then we'll talk about it. The story had held us round the fire sufficiently breathless, but except the obvious remark that it was gruesome, as on Christmas Eve in an old house a strange tale should essentially be, I remember no comment uttered till somebody happened to note it as the only case he had met in which such a visitation had fallen on a child. The case, I may mention, was that of an apparition in just such an old house as had been gathered us for the occasion. An appearance of a dreadful kind to a little boy sleeping in the room with his mother and waking her up in the terror of it. Waking her not to dissipate his dread or soothe him to sleep again, but to encounter also herself, before she had succeeded in doing so, the same sight that had shocked him. It was this observation that drew from Douglas, not immediately but later in the evening, a reply that had the interesting consequence to which I call attention. Someone else told a story, not particularly effective, which I saw he was not following. This I took for a sign that he had himself something to produce, and that we should only have to wait. We waited, in fact, till 2 nights later, but that same evening, before we scattered, he brought out what was in his mind. So, what's the effect of beginning with this framing story, rather than just jumping in and telling us the governess's tale? You know, what's the effect? Why do you think this happens? Yes.
So, I think like as a ghost story, you tell it, around a fire or someplace, normalized for readers. And I guess readers would also be doing the same thing, reading the newspaper for their families, right?
Right.
So I guess finding yourself in the same kind of.
So the frame works to solicit the reader as a participant. I like that. I think that's right. Yeah. Somebody else, how else does the frame sort of work, do you think?
It establishes like some amount of grandness in like the story that's about to be told.
Can you say more about grandness?
Just the fact that they talked about like how long it was weighing on the narrator or the person's mind before he told what it was. Create some amount of eeriness, some amount of grandiosity.
It gives the story a sense of heightened weight or importance. Yeah, it's a sort of suspenseful, right? Good. Good. Those are great. What else? Yeah.
A little bit, I think it sort of gets the reader like excited, like
Yes.
because the first like 8 pages before they actually start the story.
Right.
I'm like, well, what is it? What's the story?
Right. Exactly. All right. So aside from this, I like that you said that it gets the reader excited. I think part of what the attempt to sort of talk about here is the way in which it plays on the reader's sensibility. And I'm using an old kind of romanticism word to talk about affect, like it affects them in a bodily way, like how when you're scared, or when the hair stands up on your arm or in the back of your neck. It's supposed to actually not just appeal to your intellect, but to your senses, and by having this heightened kind of suspense, just like she sees Quint the first time, but she doesn't say anything. Right? So there's this time lag, and all during that time you're sort of like not sure what's going to happen next. I saw a movie, what was it? Oh, I know. I saw a movie called Uncut Gems, which you should see. It's really, really good. And the whole movie, every single time this character is walking along the street or at his house pushing the garbage can down the thing, you're waiting for him to be attacked because he's in a lot of trouble from a lot of people, and you're just waiting, and it doesn't happen, and it just kind of builds the suspense, right, until it does happen, of course, but it doesn't happen until it does, and it's that suspense thing, I think, is part of it's a game that James plays. But what about this character of Douglas? And when I ask you these questions, a lot of people will say, a lot of my students think I know the answer, I have an answer. I really don't understand Douglas, so let me be sure. Sometimes I'm playing a stupid teacher game, and I'm going, what do you think about this? When I really have an idea, I don't really have an idea about Douglas. Yes.
So there was a story we had to read from one class last semester. It was the author Rip Van Winkle, but it wasn't Rip Van Winkle. It was like a painting and like the room.
Yes. Thank you, Dr. Hughes. Yeah. Of course.
And Douglas reminds me of the hostess telling the story.
So.
I guess his role is just to be the storyteller.
Douglas. Okay, so right. So traditionally, in narrative theory, we say that this is about verisimilitude or about believability. So if you have the governess, you're going to learn that I draw stick figures. So just bear with me for a second. If you have the governess, and then you have Douglas, and then you have the narrator, who then reads the document written by the governess. This is sort of her squared, right? Her narrative. That's kind of like the frame, right? Isn't it sort of like that? That the governess tells the story to Douglas, so we have the believability that it actually came from her, right? She gives him the document. Douglas then reads it to the whole group, the whole party, of which the narrator is one, and the narrator later transcribes it. Is that what happens? Transcribes a copy? I can't remember. What?
Maybe I missed.
He gives him a copy? I don't remember. Does anybody have a clear sense of what happens?
I got really confused throughout the entire. For a minute there, I didn't know who the governess was.
Right. Let me say a word about confusion and Henry James. The word to think about here all the time when you're reading this book and any Henry James is syntax. So you know what that is. That's the if grammar is the theory of the sentence, how you put a sentence together. Syntax is how almost you put it's also the way a sentence can be put together, but it's the way a sentence can be really, really long or really, really short. It can be, when it's really, really long, we tend to say that it's hypotactic, meaning that there are a lot of parallel clauses and conditional clauses and phrases, right, in the sentence. When it's really, really short, we say it's paratactic. Like if I say, the water bottle was on the table, the book was next to the water bottle, the other book was next to that book, and I was teaching the class. That's paratactic sentences. You don't necessarily know which is the most important part of that. But if you use hypotactic, you say something like, while I was teaching the class, there was a water bottle, a book, another book on the table. The important thing you get is that, actually I'm not sure in that sentence, but the important thing is the stuff on the table. I'm botching this up. But the point is that and the reason I'm saying this is I think it's really important that he uses this convoluted sentence structure in a ghost story. I think it really works because there's a convoluted kind of mental thing going on for the governess, right? Whether or not we believe in the visitation, which I think is an open question, you'll see when you get to the end of the book. One thing is very certain, that is that her thinking is very, very convoluted. Her thinking is very, very hypotactic, filled with a lot of different, well, if I want him to like me for this, I should do a good job of that, but the children are like this, and what about these ghosts, and I don't know, and da-da-da-da-da, and all this stuff going back on at home, right? She is, and therefore, perhaps because of this kind of overwhelmedness, we could say in current parlance that she's easily triggered, right? Because she has so much stuff going on. So I think the confusion, results in part from the syntax, this writing. Because I also, when I was just reading to you, I was in the middle of a sentence going, wait, who is she talking about? Who is the subject of the sentence? And I realized that he was not following. It wasn't the reader of the story that wasn't following his own story. Douglas didn't care about the story that the next person read. So there's also the relationship between the narrator and Douglas, who I take to be two men. Douglas is certainly a man, but I think the narrator's a man too, because he talks about the kind of silliness of the women and how the women all whatever. But he seems to care a lot about Douglas and think a lot about Douglas, which is weird, right? I mean, it's a weird kind of like setup. So the whole beginning part is a little bit like, and I don't know, it's not, I don't think it's that interesting to sort of like reflect on the fact that Henry James was bisexual. I don't think that's very important, but anyway, there's a weird kind of thing going on there too. Okay, so we have several things here that we've sort of pointed to in terms of the frame. It solicits the reader as a participant. It gives a sense of heightened weight or importance. So it brings the reader close. Does it also distance the reader, and if so, how? Austin, what do you think? What?
What was that? Sorry.
I said it brings the reader close by having this frame narrative. Is there any sense in which it also distances the reader? And if so, how?
Well, I guess you're going through a couple people before you get the person's story.
Yeah.
Because you're not getting it directly from the person that's
Yes, exactly. There's a weird kind of way in which we're a little bit safer. We're at a safer distance. That's great, because of the many kind of mediating figures that stand between us and the governess. I think the governess also, are we to believe that the governess wrote this all down as it was happening or after the fact? After the fact. So then you also have the problem of, we know even from brain studies that memory is very mutable and very fungible and changes over time. So even the way she tells the story puts us at a little bit of a distance from what happened. Okay. Great. So I have one more question that's weird in the beginning. Why don't we let the governess talk about meeting? Why is that told in sort of narrative form rather than. Do you know what I'm talking about? It's the end of the prologue. So from my page, in this book, from page 27 to 29, it's sort of all told in kind of a narrative again. So we're not in her point of view, but we're actually, why is this? This seems like an important thing. We would want to hear from her how she felt about the uncle, because that's such a core piece, right? What's the effect of kind of not getting directly her perspective, but like, I guess it's what she told Douglas, and Douglas then reports it to the group. What do you think? Yeah.
Maybe because it was written after the fact, it's sort of her interpretation of the events, so it's not like clouded by her like at the moment feelings and emotions and stuff.
I see, and what I think I hear you suggesting also is a difference between the telling to somebody and the retelling and the writing down. There's something different between those two acts. So it's almost more, and there's a lot of interruption from the people, right? They say, well, wouldn't you want to know? Yeah, I'd want to know what happened. And he said, well, she did too, but he didn't tell her, or whatever. Or she just said he went somewhere and died, and ultimately she decides. It's interesting. She decides to take this job even though she has mixed feelings about it for two reasons. So I just want to point that out here and make a note of this. There are two reasons. You want to tell me what they are that she decides to take the job even though she has
one reason would be family trouble.
Right? Yes. I take that to be a financial reason she needs to take the job. I think he almost says it outright. So there are these two reasons that I think really we can't separate, and her kind of attraction for the uncle and wanting him to, So she has these two that you cannot separate out: the class financial aspect of this novel and the erotic kind of interest of the characters. And so I would say that I would want to keep those two things really tight together as we continue to read and think about that even from the very get-go, she's concerned with them, right? Has anybody read Jane Eyre?
Yeah.
Okay, so this whole way in which these things play a part. That there's a strange way in which the feelings of the governess are constrained by her class position, but connected to her erotic life and psychic life, right? Good. So let's go ahead to the beginning of chapter 1, and we'll read the first part. And so my goal is for us to kind of talk through for the next 25 minutes, what happens throughout, and see if we can begin to get an understanding. And I'd like to get your impressions so far of the governess, the situation, also of the children, because I think they're very, very interesting. Yeah, very, very interesting. And Miranda, were you telling me about the movie Outside? You were. Okay. So you were telling me about the movie, Jenna. So there's a movie coming out, an adaptation of this.
Oh wait,
That's completely modernized. That it's not in this time period.
Okay. It's not set in the Victorian period.
Is that with the kid from Stranger Things? I was thinking about that while I was reading this. I was like, this
I
kid's
looked it
evil,
up
and I know it.
because-
Just look in his eyes or something. Oh man.
I'm glad you said that this kid is evil, because because this plays back to that idea. I should have mentioned this before because it's so obvious. I didn't. What does the turn of the screw refer to?
It's like when events go wrong.
Well,
right? Like when
It's like a drop of the dime.
It's when things get more tense. It's like that's the idea. Like another turn of the screw means it's another complication, another tensity. It ratchets up the intensity. What does it refer to in this book? When do we encounter that phrase, and what does it mean? It's in the prologue.
Yeah, when you mentioned like that there are 2 children.
Yes. So one children is already a turn of the screw, because that's the very first thing that we learn is that what makes that story interesting was that the visitation happened to a child. That a ghost appeared to a child. That was the first scare. That was the first turn of the screw. The another turn of the screw is to have it happen to 2 children. So there's a sense in which I just want to sort of go back to this. The children are very, very important here, and it's really easy to lose sight of them because the governess tells the story, so everything is mediated through her. And I think this is the brilliance of Henry James. And you said that the child, you see that Miles as evil.
Well, yeah, it's kind of obvious almost. Like he begins with getting kicked out of school for being hostile or something, or whatever. And he looks beautiful and he looks innocent, but like deep down, you can see look past it, which is what she's trying to ignore.
I mean, there's also the sense in which I take it that it's very ambiguous about why he was kicked out of school. It could have very been possible that he repeated things that a child his age should not know. And those could have been things he was exposed to, which is, I think, the governess's thinking, is that he was exposed through Quint and Jessel to ideas, things he shouldn't have been exposed to, repeats them at school and gets in trouble. I have a funny story about that. I'm a very lackadaisical parent when it comes to parental, supervision of media. So when my kids were little, we watched SpongeBob together all the time, even when they were very little, and then later Family Guy, without really worrying about all that kind of stuff. So there was a difficult time in our family's history, and my son was going through a kind of a tough time. So his daycare, he was only 3 or 4, and they said, we think maybe he might be kind of bullying other kids or being mean. And I thought, no, really, it's not at all bullying. And it's like, well, and I said, well, why do you think that? And he says, well, he goes around walking up to kids and saying something about jumping off a building or punching themselves in the face. And I said, this is a direct, I immediately knew it, I recognized it because I had watched the same episode. This is a direct quote from SpongeBob. He's just trying to be funny. He's just repeating what Squidward says to SpongeBob at one point. Why don't you jump off a building, kid, punch yourself in the face? And so he's walking around saying this to these kids. So this is the kind of problem. Did Miles go and say something that he shouldn't have said that he was exposed to? Or does he, in fact, correct? Yeah, that becomes
I found out about my little 4-year-old cousin at daycare. She would actually found out that she was a follower. She idolized an older girl, and who was a bully, and she started bullying other kids. And I was like, you are not a follower. You are the leader. Don't do this. But how can a 4-year-old understand when you say don't be a follower, be a leader?
Yeah, right. Okay, so let's go ahead and begin at chapter 1 and the other, somebody mentioned Jane Austen. The other sense of which I have of this a little bit is in the view of the country house in Pride and Prejudice when she first sees it. When am I blanking? I repress everything Jane Austen. Sorry, I teach her all the time, so don't get angry at me. But I have a resentment.
She sees it after she rejects Darcy.
Yeah. But I'm blanking on her name.
Elizabeth?
Elizabeth. When Lizzie sees the country house for the first time. What? Pemberley. And she sees Pemberley for the first time, right? And she's like, right. There's that sense that the governess has that same sense here. Okay. I remember the whole beginning as a succession of flights and drops, a little seesaw of the right throbs and the wrong. After rising in town to meet his appeal, I had, at all events, a couple of very bad days. Found all my doubts bristle again, felt indeed sure I had made a mistake. In this state of mind, I spent the long hours of bumping, swinging coach that carried me to the stopping place at which I was to be met by a vehicle from the house. This convenience, I was told, had been ordered, and I found, toward the close of June afternoon, a commodious fly in waiting for me. A fly is like a very small thing. I think it goes one horse is all that sort of takes you. Okay. I'm from the city. I really don't know what but that's what I've read. Okay. Driving at that hour on a lovely day through the country, the summer sweetness of which served as a friendly welcome, my fortitude revived, and as we turned into the avenue, took a flight that was probably but a proof of the point to which it had sunk. I suppose I had expected or had dreaded something so dreary that what greeted me was a good surprise. I remember as a thoroughly pleasant impression the broad, clear front, its open windows, the fresh curtains, and pair of maids looking out. I remember the lawn and the bright flowers and the crunch of my wheels on the gravel and the clustered treetops over which the rooks circled and cawed in the golden sky. The scene had a greatness that made it a different affair from my own scant home, and there immediately appeared at the door with the little girl in her hand a civil person who dropped me as decent a curtsy as if I had been the mistress or a distinguished visitor. That's interesting. In other words, as if she had been the uncle's, partner or whatever, right, the mistress, right, a distinguished visitor. I had received in Harley Street a narrower notion of the place, and that, as I recalled, made me think the proprietor still more of a gentleman, suggested that I was to enjoy what might be a matter beyond his promise. So, right, beautiful house equals beautiful man. Right? Beautiful equals good. This is we all have this problem, right? I mean, this is just the fact of it. When you read statistics of how really attractive people get farther in life, right? Or the fact that CEOs of companies are on average 6'3" or something like that. They're ginormous, large people, because people trust. I mean, they can't be better. I mean, I don't know. I mean, there's nothing intrinsically about tall people that makes them, right? So there's something about that appearance, right? So that appearance equals this. All right. I have a couple things. Does anybody want to say anything more about her? Because it's pretty obvious the way James paints it, that she's entering into a kind of swoon about the place and about the man, and then about also the children and our possibilities. But does anybody else want to say anything about this opening before I ask you a question? All right, my question has to do with this phrase that she says over and over again, which I find very strange. Now, I've read this novella probably 10 times, so over, to be honest, like 20 years, but like 10 times. But this last reading of it, this really stood out to me in this early part. I remember this. I remember this. And I remember this. I remember this. What's the effect of this? What do we make of this? Emma, what do you think? What if I said to you, you said, well, what was it like when you first, came to this campus when you were being recruited for the job? What did you think? I said, well, I remember it was a really cold day. I remember that there were these statues. I didn't really understand. I thought there were actual people fishing in the lake. And I was like, what the hell? I remember that everyone was really nice. I remember that I was scared. What's the effect of that, kind of that?
It puts the reader into her thought process when she was in that situation.
Yes, and it makes the reader responsible for making all the connections. Right? If I said, when I saw the house, I was nervous and I felt kind of twitterpated, and I thought maybe that the man, that I thought the house was beautiful, so therefore I fell in love with the man even more. She doesn't say anything quite like that. Instead, she says, I remember, and I remember, and I remember, and it's sort of like little snapshots. Boom, 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 without any continuing kind of shot. And I think it draws the reader into that perspective. Yes.
In our creative nonfiction writing, we go over a process of also saying, I remember, thinking of our first childhood.
Yes.
And as I was writing, I remember, I somehow began to think of like the most like intense things of that moment. And I feel like in this as well, that's what she's giving, exactly what she wants you to see, the most intense.
Mm-hmm.
Even if it's something as small, it's just something that just stayed with her, and that's why she's recalling it to you, even if it's something as like as minuscule as it can be to us, is something so like detrimental to her.
Do you see how also psychologically profound she is here? Or he is, I should say. It's James, really. But I mean, there's a psychological profundity here in that he sets it up by saying that I remember it as a series of flights and drops. So, okay, first of all, she probably needs she's probably bipolar, right? Flights and drops. So what I want to suggest is that these flights and drops, and then she herself says, probably the reason I was so impressed was I had been nervous, and so I got even more excited than I ordinarily would. This beautiful. There's a brilliant phrase in a poem that we're covering in our other class in the Brit Lit survey course, where Wordsworth writes, "I heard 1,000 blended notes while in a grove I sat reclined." In that sweet mood when pleasant thoughts bring sad thoughts to the mind. And it's sort of like this way in which a psychological realization that these opposites happen, these flights and drops happen for us, and that they color everything we look at. Right? So one day he's the most amazing boyfriend you've ever had and you got to keep him, and then or girlfriend, and then the next day it's like, no, I don't think so. I don't know, what was I thinking, and then later that same day, it's like whatever. He really captures that flights and drops. Okay.
So like the ups and downs of life.
Yeah, but remembering also, isn't the root of remembering really mean to put back together? Isn't that etymologically what it means? Like to member something is to attach it or something like that, like a membrane. To remember it is to put it back together. So it's almost a reconstruction in a way. I'm not a linguist, but I think that the etymology holds up. I could be wrong. So she comes. So let's take a second before we talk about the Quint, and then that'll probably be it. We'll talk about Quint and then her kind of interaction with Gross, because I think that's really important. But why don't you give me your first? No one's read this before, yeah? Okay, give me your first impressions so far of the book, and what you're drawn to, and what your thinking is about it. Maybe somebody who hasn't talked yet. Yeah, Luke.
I actually haven't gotten to read the book
Oh,
yet,
okay.
but just from this discussion, this is pretty crazy how much this book seems to try to use all these different methods just to draw this reader into this almost like first person's perspective.
Yes.
Like it really just seems to want to make you a part of this like this event or this story that's currently being built just at the start of it. Yeah.
Yes. So that there are two moments. There are two events, really, at least, There's more. Let's say that for purposes of our discussion, there are 3 events. There's the event of the telling of the story, and the reading of the text to the people around the fire in the fancy manor house. There's the events that happened to the governess, and then there's our event of reading all of it. And each event, in a certain sense, carries with it some of the intensity of all the other moments, right? And it almost requires that kind of retroactive thing in order for it to kind of function. Other people's impressions. Yes.
I'm kind of drawn to the fact that he is writing in a woman's perspective.
Yeah.
I mean, I think he handles it so well.
He's a great writer of women's psychology.
It threw me off at first,
yeah.
and then I was like, oh, it's actually kind of nice.
Yeah.
And how he kind of shows a woman's view on it, I guess.
Yeah.
It's kind of impressive.
Yeah.
That's why his friend said that he looked at women as women look at women.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why people wondered if he was actually
I
homosexual.
see.
I think that makes sense why Catholic writes as a...
Yes, I like that very much. Yes.
And there's like an interesting contrast of like the depiction of the women in the prologue who seem very like dense and like, ooh, tell the story, you know, but then like Douglas kind of like ignores them. And they want to hear the story, but then they end up leaving because they don't, you know, really care, they're not invested. But then like to hear, I guess the governess's
Yes.
version.
What's difference between those women?
Between them and the governess?
Yeah.
I think like this psychological like weakness.
Yes.
So they just like didn't.
What's different in terms of their situations?
Right, they're probably there at the like Christmas party drunk and like, you know.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So I think, because it also said in the introduction that he was misogynistic to women he didn't know, but like respected women he was friends with, I think. Or maybe I misread, but I think that's like in a letter that was written.
I see.
And he had a friend, Woolley, who he lost, and she was
Yes.
very dear to him. And I think, you know, maybe the governess is
This was short. This was in the 1890s, so it was like shortly before writing this. Yes, he had a difficult time overcoming that loss. Yes. I was going to say there was a class difference, that his allegiances seem on the side of. It's the same thing in Portrait of a Lady. His the kind of recently moneyed or barely moneyed, you know, so hanging on to the middle class and the poor people. He has more sympathy with them than he does with the really upper class ladies. They just seem to be kind of I don't know, shark-like and mean. Yeah.
I think that maybe his relationship with like presenting a woman's psychology isn't so great, because he's characterizing the main character as being like deeply attracted to her boss and a subjugative role to a man.
Yeah.
Which isn't, you know, quite so feminist, I'd say.
Yes. There's a great work. Any of you who are interested in feminists, we'll talk about it when we get to the feminists. But there's a great work called Mad Woman in the Attic about this whole genre of women. Those of you who read Jane Eyre will know that. Yeah. So this whole generation of women in the 19th century, written mostly by male authors, sometimes by women authors, like the Bronte novel. But like, it's like, I get your point. I absolutely get your point, and I think it's a good one. I think we have to hold this as a kind of balancing act. I think it's both. When you say he's not very good, you mean he's not very sympathetic. Yeah. I think it's both.
I don't think we should like shut out her sexuality though, because like it's a woman's right to be attracted to someone, and it's a woman's right to like want to be someone's lady, you know what I mean? And if like she wants to have, obviously the governess is like longing for that family, that healthy like family dynamic, and I mean it's not a feminist thing to like, you know, shut her down because her wants are not like she doesn't want to be like president or something.
Yes. I think that the problem with her sexuality isn't our problem, it's her problem. if I can put it in that regard. And I think that we get a hint that her father was a country parson. We get another hint that she cannot go to church. She cannot seem to get herself into church. I think that she has her, in other words, I think not because there's something evil about her, but she is ambivalent about her own sexual feelings. And that then becomes what happens oftentimes psychologically, and James is really good about this, is this kind of negation becomes a projection onto others. Like everything becomes hypersexualized around her, like her interest in Miss Jessel, right, which we read, right? She's like, well, Miss Gross, was she inappropriate in other ways? ... And she's like, well, I'm not going to talk about that because that's But right, it becomes this kind of like it becomes a hyper kind of projection of sexuality everywhere. And on that note, let's just read this this section. It is my page 39. Our page 39 if you have this edition. So it's at the end of chapter 3 if you have a different edition. Towards the end of chapter 2. It was plump one afternoon in the middle of my very hour. The children were tucked away, and I had come out for a stroll. One of the thoughts that, as I don't in the least shrink now from noting, used to be with me in these wanderings, was that it would be charming, as a charming story, suddenly to meet someone. Someone would appear there at the turn of the path and would stand before me and smile and approve. This is almost directly like, doesn't this feel exactly like Pride and Prejudice here? It's like when she runs into Darcy at Pemberley, like, and, I didn't ask for more than that. I only asked that he should know, and that the only way to be sure he knew would be to see it, and the kind of light of it in his handsome face. That was exactly present to me, by which I mean the face was, when, on the first of these occasions, at the end of a long June day, I stopped short on emerging from one of the plantations and coming into view of the house. What arrested me on the spot, and with a shock much greater than any vision had allowed for, was the sense that my imagination had, in a flash, turned real. He did stand there, but high up, beyond the lawn, and at the very top of the tower to which on that first morning little Flora had conducted me. The tower was one of a pair, square, incongruous, crenellated structures that were distinguished for some reason, though I could see little difference, as the new and the old. They flanked opposite ends of the house and were probably architectural absurdities, redeemed in a measure, indeed, not being wholly disengaged, nor at a height too pretentious, dating, in their gingerbread antiquity, from a romantic revival that was already a respectable past. That's a sentence and a half. I admired them, had fancies about them, for we could all profit in a degree, except when they loomed through the dark by the grandeur of their actual battlements. Yet it was not at such an elevation that the figure I had so often invoked seemed most in place. I have no idea what that whole architectural discussion about the Twin Towers are, except there may be a joke here, a kind of joke about phallic symbols, possibly the man she wants to see and the man instead she sees. I don't know. The old and the new. Okay, so maybe I have more, like, whatever. You're like, oh, you're Professor Ruderman, you're so, like, vulgar. Okay. It produced in me this figure in the clear twilight. I remember two distinct gasps of emotion. There's a lot of twos going on here. There's a lot of doubling. Which were, sharply, the shock of my first and that of my second surprise. My second was a violent perception of the mistake of my first. The man who met my eyes was not the person I precipitously supposed. There came to me thus a bewilderment of vision, of which, after these years, there is no living view that I can hope to give. An unknown man in a lonely place is a permitted object of fear to young women privately bred, And the fact that that faced me was, a few seconds more assured me, as little anyone else I knew as it was what? Okay, as little anyone else I knew, I get it, as it was an image that had been in my mind. I had not seen it in Harley Street. I had not seen it anywhere. The place, moreover, in this Harley Street was where the office was. Yeah, so she's being really clear here, right? I hadn't seen it in that, right? The place, moreover, in the strangest way in the world, had on the instance, by the very fact of its appearance, become a solitude, to me at least, making my statement here with a deliberation with which I never made it. The whole feeling of the moment returns. I'm gonna stop here because I'm running out of time and I need to get going. But let me say a couple things here, and then I want to point out two things, and you might make notes of these. First is that her remembering when she's writing the document allows her to notice that she had repressed in the moment who her real desire was for. But she recognizes when she writes it, which really is a weird, usually you think that if it was a fantasy of Quint, it would kind of dissipate somewhat. Maybe I didn't see it, I don't know, and now that looking back on it, I was really attracted to the uncle, so maybe I just made it up. She doesn't say any of that. So it's a weird kind of recognition. The return of the repressed is a return of something no longer repressed. Does that make any sense? Do you get what I'm saying? Is that clear? Yeah. That to me is weird. That's the first thing. The second thing is that she admits to being under a spell of the children. That is on page 43. So you might notice that. She recognizes afterwards the fact that she was under a spell of the children. She recognizes after the fact that she had been repressing her desire for the uncle. And I think these are very interesting retroactive understandings of where she was, because it doesn't produce in her any lessening or any clarity. So it's a kind of critique of that psychoanalytic idea that if you uncover the repressed, it then goes away, or you then overcome your neuroses. In a certain sense, she doesn't. It remains there. So that gives further credence to either the fact that there's something deeper going on, and the spell, and let me put it this way. The uncle is not the primary source. He's in fact the secondary source. There's some other trauma, some unworked through material here that might go back to the childhood, the problems at home. We don't know. Okay? Any questions about that? I'm sorry I have to run. I won't do this again. Get together in groups, get your group situation worked out, and I will see you.